Good morning. I too would like to add my thanks to ILSI for this invitation to speak in front of you distinguished folks. This is going to be more of a practical review of what's happened specific to my company as far as this issue, sodium reduction, is concerned. So, I messed it up already. Here we go. So for those of you who don't know who we are, we're not a CPG company, so you won't find us in the grocery store. We are a manufacturer of Italian cheeses, primarily mozzarella cheese and provolone, and that's all we make as far as cheese is concerned. We are, however, the largest mozzarella producer. We were started by an immigrant from Italy. We're still privately held. We operate 9 plants across the country, headquartered in Denver, Colorado. We do have operations in the UK and commercial offices in Asia. Our products are primarily B2B, so we service manufacturers. We're a food ingredient manufacturer. Of course, when you make cheese, you have whey that comes out of the cheese, and so quite a bit of our whey products find their way into infant nutrition and sports nutrition, primarily whey protein concentrate, lactose, and a little bit of non-fat dry milk. Across the bottom there is our one of our larger plants in California. So today my talk is going to be focused primarily around Leprino, mozzarella cheese, and the products that we produce, along with our customers who are the producers of the products you buy. We'll talk a little bit just to center you, counter table, what do we start with and what do we end up with. Functionality of sodium in cheese, a lot's been said about that, so I won't dwell on that. And then the fact that we do have regulatory standards and labeling involved here in some of the challenges associated with this. A lot has been talked about that as well. So this is what comes out of the cow when we get milk in our plants. As you'll see, out of the all of that milk, we are really only dealing with about 12% solid. So inherent in that is a protein, fat, lactose, which is the primary carbohydrate that is in milk, and then the ash component. What you find in that ash component, so really where is the sodium coming from? This is where the sodium is coming from, the ash component, and this is in milligrams per 100 mils of milk. So we start off with very high proportion of calcium, potassium, and phosphorus, and you'll see sodium there, a little bit of sulfur and magnesium. When we make cheese, this again will be mozzarella cheese, but primarily when you make cheese, you're adding coagulants, you're separating the caseins from your human whey-type proteins. We actively add salt to the curd. We also passively add salt as we cool the cheese through the salt brine and then it's packaged. So very simple process. Functionality, a lot's been talked about fermentation, but salt does allow us to control the activity of our starter cultures. It basically gives you a much more uniform fermentation process. It allows us to be able to control that process. By way of cooling, I mean, obviously when you make mozzarella cheese, I guess what's different about mozzarella cheese from some of the cold type cheeses is after the curd is made, we go through what is called a pasta filata process, which is the heating and kneading and stretching of the curd, which is what gives you that typical mozzarella characteristic. But that cheese is coming off the mixers at about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and you have to cool it down very quickly, again, by way of controlling what's happening after that cheese is made. And so we float the cheese through, as most people do, through a salt brine. And it acts to cool the cheese rapidly, depending on how you do it. But in doing that, it also imparts a certain amount of salt, because we add salt to the brine to allow us to get it cold enough, and adds a little bit of the preservative there. A lot's been said about salt and its impact on flavor, and so we won't talk about that. From a regulatory standpoint, there are standards of identity for cheeses, and there are allowable ingredients, and you see those there. When FDA says salt, sodium chloride is what they're talking about. There's a lot said about salt substitutes, and those, when they are used, do have to be labeled if they are not salt, if they are something else other than salt. So if we want to look at that, basically we have, from a product development standpoint, caveat, I'm not a product developer. I'm a microbiologist. I will talk from a high level as far as some of the steps there and some of the strategies. Basically, you have two options. You can totally eliminate salt, but we talked about that earlier. It's not totally possible to do that, because if you go down the bottom side of this flow chart, we need the salt to help us control the activity of the starter cultures. We also need salt in our brine to allow us to rapidly cool that cheese so it's not staying at a nice warm temperature for days on end. What happens when you completely remove salt is your product performance is different. Really what you find, if you don't use brine, most of you know mozzarella cheese, or most cheeses have what we call a rind, which will be the shell around the outside of the cheese, where a lot of moisture, by osmosis, is removed into the brine. That portion, usually about 1/8 to 1/4 inch, depending on how long you float it through the brine, will be a little tougher. It'll be pretty high salt, but that does protect the product. It gives it its characteristics. When you remove salt, or you don't add any salt at all, that is a really mushy piece of cheese, and you don't have the texture characteristics that have been talked about. And all those lead to consumer acceptance. So it is not possible to take all of the salt out. The more practical approach is to reduce the amount of salt that is added by use of salt alternatives, or not at all. But again, the impact there is product performance. The product will be a little different. Standards of identity will be impacted if you use sodium or salt replacers, and again, consumer acceptance is a problem there. Nevertheless, it can be done. The approach my company took earlier with all this is to actually focus on the whole food. So we know that pizza has been vilified. That is the industry we play in. And so we took a look at, you'd see various foods there. We looked at the entire meal. And we looked at not just the cheese, but the crust that's been talked about, pepperoni, and essentially our culinary people work with our partners, our customers, in order to make these reductions. But there is a cost to that. Somebody said earlier, salt is a cheaper ingredient, and that is so. Unintended consequences when you do some of this, certainly there's cost. But one of the things we want to make sure happens is that we don't lose sight of the fact that dairy is a very nutrient-dense product line. And we don't want to formulate or scare consumers away from that. Dry whey products, or dry milk powders, also provide quite a bit of nutrition, and you see those numbers there. So in conclusion, there are technical functions in cheese making for salt. Reformulation is going on. We are constrained a little bit by regulatory standards, but that again can be done. There needs to be balanced food policy that will shape consumer behavior, and we need to be aware of unintended consequences. And then the last question I want to ask, actually, or leave you with is, it is possible, or is it possible, that potassium chloride is going to, or the focus on potassium is going to remove some of the stigma that's associated with potassium chloride when consumers perhaps see potassium chloride on a label? Rhetorical question. I thank you for your attention.
Again, I guess, as you've heard others, I have one, if you don't mind. Looking at the case study before and your case study, the differences between, say, a dairy product and a soup, they're myriad. Are there a couple of commonalities you can think of in your experience comparing to what you've seen with others?
Well, certainly you can look at cheese by itself, but for us, the approach we took, because we make a product that is not typically eaten by itself. So it finds its way into compound food. So no different than soup, you're going to find mozzarella cheese, provolone cheese in a number of compound foods. And so our approach was to look at the entire food, so the reductions are essentially impacting that entire product. We focused on pizza because children like pizza. Pizza is a big part of the American diet, and rather than have that whole food vilified, we wanted to look at it more in terms of how could you make it more healthy and continue and have people continue to enjoy it. So I think those are some of the commonalities. These are compound foods.